So this project, or this line of research, as you said, is about looking at the factors that predict verbal analogy performance. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on item factors like semantic distance, which is probably the main one that's been investigated, as well as some individual differences. First, I'm going to talk about verbal analogy processes, just the very basics processes that Sternberg talked about in his early research. And then I'll spend the first half of the presentation going over 3 item factors that we looked into in a recent paper. And I'll touch on a couple other papers briefly as well that looked at these factors of semantic distance, probably the most common one, distractor salience, probably the second most common one, and relation type, which hasn't been investigated as much as the first 2. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'll talk about an earlier study that I did with Zachary Estes, looking at creative thinking and crystallized intelligence. And then I'll briefly mention a couple other individual differences that I'm interested in ongoing and future studies. So what I mean by verbal analogy is the typical proportional A is to B, a C is to D form in which the first 2 words are related to each other in the same way as the last 2. And I use verbal analogy here in contrast to semantic analogies, which could also include pictorial analogies. And as Sternberg wrote in his classic papers, there are several component processes in verbal analogy. And the 3, these aren't all of them, but the 3 main ones that have been most investigated are the relational inference, where you infer the relation in the source pair, and then you transfer it to in guiding the selection or the generation or the verification of the correct D term or CD pair. The studies I'm going to talk about today have mostly used analogical selection tasks, with a couple using, or one of them using, analogical generation tasks. And then probably the most investigated component process would be structure mapping, or line one-to-one mapping, in which you are aligning the corresponding elements of the pairs, the A term to the C term and the B term to the D term. And I'll talk more about that in the context of these 3 item factors. And then response selection is focused on, if you have an analogy form of A is to B is C is to blank, selecting the correct D term, for instance. It could also be selecting the CD pair, or verifying that the first pair has the same relation as the second pair in a verification task, or generating a second pair, although that would be more response generation. In a recent study that examined item factors, they found that ones like word familiarity, semantic distance, and relation type influence the difficulty of one or more of these processes, and in turn, the performance on an analogical task. And this study looked at several data sets of analogies, including some from those in this room. I think they looked at one of your data sets, Matt. And one of the item factors that they talked about briefly is word familiarity. And this is probably one of the most noticeable features of analogies, in that those old verbal analogies that you used to see on the standardized tests like the SAT and the GRE included less familiar words, which of course makes those analogies much more difficult, because you have to know or at least have a sense of the terms in order to process the analogy. So those types of analogies included on those old standardized tests tested vocabulary on top of analogical reasoning. In order to just focus on the analogical reasoning processes, all of the analogies used in all of my studies have high word familiarity. These item factors, the semantic distance in particular, and distractor salience and type of relation, all affect the one or more of the component processes. and the relative ease and the accuracies on the analogy. So the first paper I'm going to discuss is the one that we just published. And I did this along with Bob Morrison and Matt Kmiecik and Jessica Irwin. And this was recently published in February. So I'll spend most of the time talking about this one. This one had a large sample size of Wayne State undergrads, and it was around 45% male, 55% female. So nice even distribution of both genders. And then the task entailed a verbal analogy selection task, three terms in the stem, and then participants had to select the correct answer. And there were only two answer choices, the correct answer or a distractor. I'll talk more about what the distractor was in a minute. The design was a 2 by 2 by 3 with semantic distance varied between far and near, and distractor salience high or low. And the relation type, we looked at 3 commonly used analogical relations, categorical, compositional, and causal. And I'll give you some examples of these items on an upcoming slide. But there were 60, each participant had 60 analogies, and there were 5 of each type. And the dependent variable was accuracies. So the first factor, semantic distance, reflects the similarity between the domains represented in the source and the target pairs. So you have the near semantic distance analogies where the AB and the CD pairs are both within the same thematic domain. Both represent a kitchen theme. And both of the objects, if they're not perceptually similar, then they are, or featurally similar, then they're thematically, in the same place. And then the far analogies were in 2 completely different domains. So wrench and tool and sad and mood, both sharing the same relation, but no similarity really or association to speak of between the A and C terms and the B and D terms, which makes mapping harder when you lack the superficial similarity or featural similarity between the corresponding AC and BD terms. It makes it harder to map. So for that reason, and as shown in several earlier studies, we predicted that the near analogies would have higher accuracies than the far analogies. Then the next variable we looked at was distractor salience. And this is defined a little bit differently from word association, where you're looking at the association strength within each pair. Here, we're focused on the association strength, and more than that, the semantic distance between the C term with the correct D term in comparison with each of the incorrect distractor terms. So as I said before, each analogy had 2 answer choices, the correct answer, and 1 of 2 types of distractors. The high salience distractor had a higher similarity. By similarity, I really mean semantic distance, also association strength between the C and incorrect distractor term in comparison to the correct distractor term. So for instance, gold and the incorrect distractor silver were semantically closer than gold and the correct answer earring. With a low salience distractor term, the similarity between the incorrect distractor and the C term was less than that for the C term and the correct answer. So gold and aluminum had a further semantic distance, lower association in comparison to gold and earring. So as you can see here, across distractor salience, the same AB pair was used, and only the distractor item was varied. So I'm not looking at the association strength between the A and the B term. And based on several other studies looking at that included the association strength between the C and the D term, we predicted that the low distractor salience would have higher accuracies than high salient distractors, or than the analogies having the high salient distractors. Then we looked at 3 analogical relations. The first one is a very simple superordinate categorical, where the A and the C terms are members of the B and the D terms category. For instance, Robin is a member of bird. And compositional analogies entailed ones in which the A and the C terms are materials of the B and the D terms objects. I've also seen this relation used in the reverse order, where you had the object and then the material, like saddle leather. So I've seen it both ways. I haven't compared it both ways yet, but I chose to have it with material and then object. And then the causal, the A and the C terms are causes of the B and the D terms effects. And of course, with this type of relation, the reverse order wouldn't make much sense. In fact, people have tested that very thing with the causal relations. So you pretty much need to have it in this order. It's hard enough for this analogy with the cause and then the effect. So as an example, an allergy could cause a sneeze. There are several theories that would account for differences across the analogical relation types. One is the microcategory account by Adam Green and colleagues, in which they argue that the categorical relations are spontaneously activated during analogy. So then when you see an analogy with the word pair robin bird, when you see robin, its category is spontaneously activated. And then related to my research on integrative priming, we came up with the complementary role activation theory, which argues that there's varying degrees of semantic constraints by the relational roles. So the relational roles were things like cause, material, or member, category member. And those constraints, those roles constrain the second term, in this case, the B or the D term, and the likelihood of activation. So if you see Robin, it's more constraining once you realize what the relation is. It's more constraining that it's likely to have the category as that second term. So based on these two accounts, we predicted that the categorical relations would have higher accuracies than the causal and the compositional. I didn't have any a priori prediction between the causal and the compositional, however, because these two have not really been compared in prior studies. In addition to those 3 main effects, we predicted several interactions, and the first one being that semantic distance and distractor salience would interact, such that high distractor salience will impair performance more on the far than on the near analogies. And the reason for this prediction is that when you have those far analogies, like leather is to saddle as gold is to earring, then the lure of silver as one of the distractors can kind of throw you off, grab your attention away from keeping in mind that analogical relation of that compositional relation as you're mapping. So it can kind of, I like to say, derail the mapping process. It's more likely to than if you have that superficial similarity, like between bowl and dish and spoon and silverware, helping you to kind of stay on track with the mapping. And then the next hypothesis, in terms of the relation type and semantic distance, the far semantic distance would impair performance less on the categorical than on the causal or the compositional analogies. And that's simply because of that strong activation for that categorical relation. It's less susceptible to the having different domains between the AB and the CD pairs. So in other words, wrench is to mood, or I'm sorry, wrench is to tool as sad as to mood. You can keep in mind, it doesn't matter that there's less similarity between the corresponding terms because you have that strong categorical relation being automatically, spontaneously activated anyway. And same thing with distractor salience. You're less likely to get thrown off by that strong high salient distractor. So leather is to saddle as gold is to earring versus silver. You're, well, actually in this case, with that compositional one, it might throw you off more to have that high lore on the compositional in comparison to the categorical. But wrench is to mood, or yeah, wrench is to mood as, wrench is to tool as sad is to mood. The high salient lure happy is less likely to distract you because of that strong categorical relation. And then finally, we predicted a three-way interaction such that the combination of distractor salience and far semantic distance would impair performance less on the categorical than on the causal or compositional analogies. So in other words, this semantic distance by distractor salience interaction would vary across the relation such that it would be much stronger in the causal or compositional analogies. And here's an example of some of the materials. So as you can see from this table here, semantic distance was between items. 30 of our 60 items were semantically near and 30 were semantically far. And then within each, we had all three relations represented. And then as I said earlier, the AB pair was kept the same between the high salient distractor and the low salient distractor condition. So for instance, January is to month as winter is to season, with the high salient distractor being summer, having this opposite relation, and the low salient distractor being sport, having a temporal relation. So both the high and the low salient distractors obviously had a different relation from the analogical one. All of these pairs were taken or adapted from prior analogy studies and from conceptual combination studies, which was an area of my research in grad school and shortly afterwards. And they were extensively normed, at first using LSA cosines, and then the reviewers came back and said, norm them more. There are a lot more recent ways to norm them and assess semantic distance than just LSA cosines. Fortunately, semantic distance had been developed in that time. So that was a really nice online tool for getting additional semantic distance measures. And then in terms of the high versus the low salient distractor, comparing that with the C term, the correct term, in terms of its semantic distance with the C term, the association norms work really well for that as well. And in terms of these categories of high versus low, there wasn't too much overlap between them. There are some items that were a little overlapping, but for the most part, these were pretty orthogonal. Then, as I mentioned earlier, word familiarity is something that you have to keep in mind. And with these studies, I want to take the vocabulary knowledge of the terms out of the equation. So all of the terms, all of the answers, options, all of the A, B, C, and D terms, all of the analogies were words that had been acquired by age 13 and a half, with the average age of acquisition being 6.4. So a brief demonstration of the procedure. These were completed in a computerized task in which participants with DirectRT, which participants were shown the analogy stem for 500 milliseconds, and then the answer options for 250 milliseconds, and then were prompted to enter the number of the correct answer. And the order of the answer options was counterbalanced across the experimental list. Okay, so the results, call that for semantic distance. We have the classic finding that's been found in many, many studies, the hypothesis that the near analogies will have higher accuracies than the far. And that was indeed the case. there were higher accuracies for the near analogies than the far, and this was a pretty robust effect, as you can see here. And this is kind of noticeable because these terms were, or notable rather, these terms were high in word familiarity, and they the analogies entailed only 2 answer choices. And you can see the accuracies are not at ceiling, so there's still a lot of, and there was a lot of, I don't show the standard deviations here, but there's a lot of variability. So that hypothesis was supported, not surprisingly. And then distractor salience, our hypothesis was that the analogies with the low salient distractor would have higher accuracies than those with the high salient distractor. And consistent with several prior studies, there were higher accuracies for the low than the high salient distractors. And you can see here, that's also a very robust effect. So that hypothesis was supported as well. Moving on to the relations, recall that we predicted the categorical relations would have higher accuracies than the causal and the compositional. And we found a main effect for relation type, again, a pretty robust effect here. And our hypothesis was supported that the categorical relations indeed had higher accuracies than the other 2. We also found that the compositional relations had higher accuracies than the causal. In terms of the interactions, the first prediction was that high distractor salience would impair performance more on the far than the near analogies. And we found a reliable interaction for that. As you can see from this graph, there's a greater effect of semantic distance, or I'm sorry, of distractor salience for the far than the near analogies. And in terms of relation type and semantic distance, the far semantic distance will impair performance less on the categorical than the causal or the compositional analogies. And that's also what we found. As you can see here, reliable interaction and no, actually, so not only less, but no impairment at all of semantic distance on the categorical relations. In other words, with these categorical relations, it didn't matter whether the AB and the CD pairs were in the same domain or different domains. Whereas it did matter greatly for the causal and the compositional relations. And again, this is likely because of just the robust activation of that categorical relation stays in mind as you're doing that mapping process or the relational transfer process. And then in terms of the relation type and distractor salience, this hypothesis was also supported and reliable interaction, as you can see here. In this case, there was an effect of distractor salience within the categorical relation, though stronger effects of distractor salience for the causal and the compositional relations. So high distractor salience impaired performance to a lesser extent on the categorical, but still a little bit than in the causal or compositional analogies. Then the 3-way interaction, we predicted that the combination of high distractor salience and far semantic distance will impair performance less on the categorical than on the causal or compositional. And as you can see here, a reliable 3-way interaction. And within the compositional analogy, starting up on the right, we see an interaction between distractor salience and semantic distance, such that the distractor salience had a much greater impact within the far than the near analogies. The same pattern occurred for the causal analogies. And you can see the accuracies here were at the lowest for the far, semantic distance, high distractor salience, analogies within the causal relation. But you can see that same type of interaction here with a greater impairment of distractor salience within the far than the near causal analogies. And then with the categorical analogies, there really was no such interaction. You had a main effect of the distractor salience, as I showed you on that last slide, but no interaction in terms of greater impairment within the far than the near. So some notable implications of this study, that the semantic distance effect supports the hypothesis that semantic similarity between the domains facilitates the one-to-one mapping of corresponding analogy terms. That's been argued and shown many times before. But what's novel to this study is that the impact of semantic distance varies across relations. Most prior semantic distance or studies investigating semantic distance didn't really look at the analogy relation as a factor. And then another implication or contribution is that the semantic distance by distractor salience interaction demonstrated that a high salience distractor can derail that mapping process more so for the far than for the near analogies. And it could derail the mapping process, for instance. Leather is to saddle as gold is to earring. You don't have that similarity between the corresponding terms. Leather doesn't have any similarity with gold. So, but it has that relational similarity. So that mapping relies only on the relational similarity and doesn't have the semantic similarity to help it out. Therefore, it's more susceptible to the lure of silver, which is more strongly connected, semantically closer to the C term gold. And this interaction hasn't really been examined much in verbal analogy. I was prompted by a reviewer to address that, but not really, it hasn't really been systematically studied. This was the first study that I know of anyway that looked at this interaction within these types of verbal analogies. They had, I'll back up and say it had probably been addressed. I think it had been addressed in other studies using different types of analogies, like a scene analogy task, but within verbal analogy studies, it hadn't been looked at. And then some more notable implications. There was greater accuracy for the categorical analogies, supporting the microcategory account that argues the spontaneous activation of the categorical relation. However, that could also reflect the exemplar category word pairs being more semantically constraining for that possible second term. And then the lure of the more salient distractor impacted performance even for the categorical relations, which corroborates the individual differences that others have found, showing that inhibitory control plays a really important role in analogy. So about those analogical relations, our study wasn't designed to discern the exact underlying reason for the superior performance for the categorical relations, whether, for instance, it was that automatic activation of the categorical relation or the greater constraint of that superordinate categorical relation. One way to discern this a little more would be to compare this very constraining type of relation with another similarly constraining type of analogical relation, like opposite. Day is to night as morning is to evening. That would be a nice semantically near example. But to do that, you would have that strong opposite relation. So once you realize, oh, okay, this is an opposite relation, then it's very constraining what that D term has to be. And by the way, one person, Sternberg, in one of his earlier studies, did look at these two analogies. He looked at the opposite and that category superordinate, and he found those were two of the analogical relations that had the best performance. Other than him, I don't know of anyone who has included these two analogies in their comparison. Then another point that I talked about in the discussion of that paper is how well a given word pair represents its assigned relation, and how well the same relation is represented in both the source and the target pairs could also affect the analogical mapping. In other words, allergy is and sneeze, that word pair. How well does it represent that causal relation? Most people would say, yeah, allergy is a frequent cause of sneezing. But there's probably some variability, and probably some more variability within those causal relations in terms of the strength of that cause-effect relation. And in case you're, I did not assess the degree to which the word pair reflects its relation, as Venn has in some of his research. But that's an important limitation to the study. It's an important thing to keep in mind that could also explain to some degree the differences across the relations, particularly with the causal and the compositional having lower accuracies than the categorical. So some additional comparisons. An earlier study from the EuroCogSci conference in 2011, I found that category superordinate, so the same type that we use in this current study, had higher accuracies and faster response times than category coordinate. And as you can see in this study, I controlled the A and the C terms such that they were the same in both types of relations. And this was an analogical selection task with 4 distractors, most of which were pretty high salient distractors. Oh, and also in all of the analogies in this study, they were semantically far. And same with this study. In this study, we compared category coordinate analogies like watermelon is to pineapple to compositional analogies. Watermelon salad, salad composed of watermelon, a dress composed of velvet. And like the study I just went over, the 2022 study, it was an analogical selection task with 1 distractor. And it was such that the distractor was controlled across the experimental list. So if you had the experimental list that showed the compositional version of this analogy, then the distractor item was silk, which kind of made it a little bit harder because half your items were category coordinate, half of them were compositional, but the distractor for the compositional was the category coordinate and vice versa. Okay, moving on now to interactions with individual difference variables and individual difference variables themselves. I'm going to talk about a study I did with Zachary Estes in Thinking and Reasoning in 2015 and mention a couple of other studies. So the first or 2 of the, I would say, most frequently examined individual differences are working memory and inhibitory control, these executive functioning variables. And they've been examined methodologically in terms of the design of the study, also in terms of neuropsychological and comparing people with frontotemporal lobe impairments and developmental studies, and as well as association predictive designs as well. So they've been examined across numerous types of studies. And then crystallized intelligence hasn't been examined probably as much, but it's also been examined a lot, particularly general knowledge and vocabulary, both in developmental studies in terms of the design of the study and regression type studies. So the research question in our study was, to what extent does creativity with a focus on convergent and divergent thinking predict verbal analogy. And I underlined verbal analogy here because there have been prior studies that looked at creative thinking using other types of tasks, like Raven's advanced progressive matrices task. But there hadn't yet been too many studies that looked at creative thinking as a predictor of verbal analogy. In fact, creative thinking is often looked at as an outcome of verbal analogy or analogical ability, or a form of it. So in terms of the convergent thinking, this entails a narrowing of possible solutions to one optimal answer. And we measured that with the remote associates test, particularly the compound remote associates test, such that the solution, which the participant had to generate for each triad, would fit with each of the words in the triad. Ice cream, ice skate, ice water. In some of the other triads, the solution word might come after the word, after one of the triad words. And then the divergent thinking task focused on generating several possible imaginative answers. And this is measured with the alternative uses test. And in this test, participants typically have 2 minutes to list as many uses as possible other than the intended use for each given object. One of the objects we used in both of the studies within this paper was wood and pencil. So in the first study, we found that higher analogy accuracies were predicted by creative cognition, meaning higher scores on the remote associates test and the alternative uses test, in particular fluency, which is an aspect of divergent thinking focused on how many responses the person generates. But we also looked at the biographical inventory of creative behaviors and found that that had no relation to analogy. So it wasn't just being creative or doing creative things. It was the creative thinking in particular that was related to verbal analogy. In the second study, we addressed 4 additional points. We assessed the impact of creative thinking above and beyond crystallized intelligence, which, by the way, is a really strong factor in verbal analogy. And that's been shown, as I mentioned, in several studies. And we added a measure of response creativity in addition to the fluency measure for the alternative uses task. And we included both an analogical generation and the analogical selection task. In other words, for the analogical generation task, the participant had to come up with the D word rather than select it from 4 or 5 choices. And we varied the semantic distance in both the analogical generation and the analogical selection task. So that way we could look at this possible interaction between creative thinking and semantic distance. So one nice thing, just to back up for a moment about this paper, one thing I love about this project is it came about organically in an email that I sent to Zachary Estes. And by the way, he was my PhD advisor. Just sending a friendly email, hey, what have you been up to in terms of your research? And I told him about this study that I'm talking about now. And he told me about a similar study that he had done looking at creative thinking and analogy. So it came together that way, where he had done the first study, I had done the second study, and they fit well within the same paper. Always kind of neat when that happens. So the first study was done at the University of Warwick, where he was in the UK, and then the second study was done at Wayne State. The crystallized intelligence consisted of a composite measure of vocabulary using the Shipley vocabulary measure and general knowledge questionnaire, which were 24 items adapted from Unsworth. And that's, by the way, his research is where I got the idea to get this composite measure, which I've used in a couple studies since then. And the AUT creativity measure consisted of a snapshot scoring process by Paul Sylvia, in which participants set of responses are rated from 1 to 5, from very creative, and they're rated on their originality, how unique is the response compared to all the other sets of responses, remoteness, how distant of a use, let's say for wood and pencil, is it from the intended use, and cleverness. And I had 2 research assistants rate these set of responses with the instructions given that they weren't to take fluency into account. In other words, you could have just 4 or 5 responses that were super creative versus 8 or so that were not as creative. So to the extent that they were able, they were to not take the number of responses into account. And then the analogy selection task consisted of 18 items, half of them near, half of them far, each with 4 distractors, so 5 answer choices. And the dependent measure was proportion correct. For the analogy generation task, I got the items from Sylvia Bunge, and they consisted of 20 near and 20 far semantically distant analogies, for which the participants provided a relationally consistent D term for this 3-term stem. And the dependent measure in that task was a proportion of relationally consistent responses. And I had some research assistants score the extent to which they were relationally consistent. And there was high inter-rater agreement for that, and for the AUT creativity as well. Okay, so the results. First thing to note is for the analogy selection task, all 3 measures of creativity, as well as the crystallized intelligence composite, were related to higher accuracies on the analogy selection task. Likewise, for the analogically consistent responses on the analogy generation task. And in terms of the analogy selection task, looking at the question of how much creativity predicts analogical performance above and beyond crystallized intelligence, we found that it predicted an additional 8% of the variability and accuracies above and beyond crystallized intelligence, and that all 3 of these predictors remained reliable in that second model there. So this is a nice finding showing that not only, of course, we included in that paper an earlier analysis in which we weren't looking at crystallized intelligence, but the fact that these 2 the creativity measure of divergent thinking was predictive above and beyond the crystallized intelligence. For the analogy generation task, it accounted for an additional 5% above and beyond crystallized intelligence, although only the convergent thinking, the rat, and the crystallized intelligence remained reliable. So it was a reliable predictor in the model, in an earlier model that didn't include crystallized intelligence, but it wasn't quite strong enough to predict it above and beyond crystallized intelligence in terms of the divergent thinking. And you can see the overall model here accounted for a nice portion of the variability. And same with this one, a little bit less in terms of the overall variability. Okay, now looking at the interaction with semantic distance. As before, not surprisingly, there was a main effect of semantic distance, such that the near analogies in both the selection task and the generation task had better performance than the far analogies, higher accuracies, and more relationally consistent responses. And then in terms of the interaction with crystallized intelligence, I didn't include this in the paper, but in looking back at that data, I found that that crystallized intelligence was more predictive for far analogies than for near analogies. And then the semantic distance by creative thinking, it didn't work for the AUT creativity measure, but with the AUT fluency measure, there was an interaction such that AUT fluency, which remembers the number of responses that you generate for the object, like wood and pencil, it was more predictive for far analogies, but it was not predictive for near analogies. So the AUT fluency, by the way, is a measure of retrieval, as in addition to being somewhat a measure of creativity, is getting at the retrieval aspect of creativity. How able are you to retrieve alternative uses from memory or to think of alternative uses? With the analogy generation task, the far analogies, you're also retrieving some more distant, perhaps semantically remote terms that would still have that analogical relation. So both crystallized intelligence and divergent thinking, AUT fluency, interacted with semantic distance such that they were stronger predictors of generating responses in far than in near analogies. And this corroborates that creative thinking is related to relational inference and transfer processes. So when you're thinking, for instance, of alternative uses for wood and pencil, the more you're able to quickly generate possible alternative uses, the greater likelihood it is you'll have that ability to think of an analogy term that fits with the analogy, but that is also remote. So semantically near analogies are aided by the semantic similarity between the corresponding A and C terms, whereas the semantically far analogies rely more on the abstraction and transfer of the analogical relation. So one of the semantically far analogies in this study was armor is to night as bark is to tree. So participants had to generate the term tree, and in doing that, they weren't able to map armor to bark and night to tree. There's no real semantic similarity between night and a tree, so that mapping is done via just the relational structure, the relational roles, aiding that, or the projection of that covers relation from that first pair to that second pair. So for these far analogies, that's where this creative thinking comes into play, where you have to think of, okay, what is this connection here between armor and night? And you have to have a greater level of abstraction, not that a knight wears armor, but a knight is covered in armor like a tree is covered in bark. So that's where that creativity comes into play with that greater abstraction. Okay, moving on to an ongoing, in progress, writing the paper now. Another individual difference of interest is autistic traits. And in this study, so spoiler alert with this study, we looked at the autistic quotient by Baron Cohen and others with crystallized intelligence and working memory as covariates. And we found that autistic quotient predicted verbal analogy performance, but did not predict performance on the Raven's progressive matrices task, which fits in with the other literature showing that participants with autism do just fine, and in some cases even better, on the Raven's progressive matrices task. So that's consistent with the literature. By the way, one reason we did this study is that there has not been as much literature investigating autism or autistic traits with verbal analogies in comparison to the plethora of research that have used other types of tasks like the Raven's task or pictorial analogies or scene analogies. The other interesting finding is sex served as a moderator. The autistic quotient, and particularly the socially related subscales of social, communication, and attention switching, predicted lower verbal analogy accuracies for men, but not for women. So this impairment of these autistic-like traits held only for the men and not for the women. I can talk more about that in a little bit. And then another area of interest, one of my other research interests is smartphone use. And I would like to one day down the road, a couple of years down the road, converge my interest in smartphone use with analogical reasoning. And so my former grad students' research focused on smartphone use and mind wandering. And in one study that he did, following up from his thesis, he looked at the amount of smartphone use. We had participants record from their smartphone how much they used overall, how much of their leisurely computing time was on their smartphone, and then the various iPhone categories of smartphone use, like social, entertainment, etc. Social, not surprisingly, was by far the greatest category of smartphone use. And we found that it wasn't a direct relationship between social smartphone use and higher self-reported spontaneous mind wandering, but rather this mediator with higher online vigilance. And higher online vigilance is this preoccupation with the online world, where you're thinking about what's going on your social media accounts, for instance. So we had a robust indirect relation. And by the way, it went in both directions as well. So in terms of tying this together with analogical reasoning, I would like to look at how this leads not only to the self-reported spontaneous mind wandering. Spontaneous is another term for unintentional. That's the disruptive, intrusive mind wandering, but also some behavioral measures reflecting that as well, like a poor sustained attention or greater distractibility. That in turn, this greater distractibility or poor sustained attention, I predict would lead to poor verbal analogy performance, particularly for those analogies with high salient distractors. And some recent literature kind of supporting those hypotheses is from one study where they looked at mobile use percentage, which was a percentage of your computing hours done using your smartphone, was related to lower performance on the cognitive reflection test. And this test is looking at logical reasoning, where you have an obvious incorrect answer, and then the correct answer is not as obvious. So it kind of has a similar structure to these analogies with high salient distractors, in which the correct answer is less salient. And then another more recent study looked at greater distractibility for those with problematic smartphone use. And they looked at the neural basis behind that and found that it was associated with inefficient recruitment of the ventral attention network. So that's nice that they were looking at, okay, what's the underlying neural cause of that? All right, so that is it. I would like to thank my collaborators, two of which are in this room, so thank you for being here. And my research assistants, who helped greatly with the coding of some of these analogies and with the creativity task. And now I will take questions. I'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts. And thanks for your attention.